Hey everybody, welcome to the Academy of Insurance's weekly webinar after show. I'm your host, George, and joining me today is the director of the Academy of Insurance and also today's instructor for the webinar. And the webinar today was CGL Masterclass, Coverage A and Selected Exclusions, and our instructor and director is none other than Mr. Patrick Raitt. Patrick, hello and welcome to the after show. How are you today?
Thanks, George. Always great when I get to teach and we get to have an after show, and just a wonderful Tuesday. It's show day.
It is show day. That's absolutely right. Very good. Yeah, I mean, I love show days personally. So the class was selected exclusions, and at the beginning of the class, you mentioned that there were more exclusions that you could have taught about than were able to be accounted for in this class because of time constraints and things like that. So can you tell us a couple of the exclusions that you left out, and why? Is it because they're too obscure, or just not something you see as often as the other exclusions that we went over today, or what was the case?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there are 16 exclusions listed under coverage A of the CGL policy, and some of them are a little more kind of straightforward. Uh, there are two exclusions related to workers' comp and employers' liability. And in fact, the idea behind those is just because we want folks to, if there's a workers' comp type claim, they should go to the workers' comp and deal with that instead. I'm actually just scrolling the exclusions now. There are other exclusions like damage to your product, damage to your work. Some of them are just simple and straightforward. I chose some of the more complicated ones that really need some time devoted to them and probably could have spent longer on them.
Sure. So you talked about selected exclusions and different ways to overcome them. Are some exclusions harder to overcome than others, and why? Just because of the nature of either the deal with property, the deal with somebody's like a bodily injury. Like what makes an exclusion harder to overcome than others?
Sure. Some of the that goes into some of why we have exclusions on a policy, and some of the exclusions are there simply because whatever the exposure is better covered somewhere else. For example, the aircraft, auto, and watercraft exclusion, that's designed so that if an insured has an exposure related to autos, they need to go get a business auto policy. If they have an exposure related to aircraft, they need to go get an aircraft liability policy. We talked a little bit about the one of many unmanned aircraft endorsements, which on the surface, the first thing it does is amends the aircraft, auto, and watercraft exclusion to add an exclusion for unmanned aircraft and then provide some coverage back. But some exclusions are such that you can buy back coverage. Others you have to buy coverage on another policy, and others are just simply uninsurable, and you can't overcome them.
You mentioned that you had written for, was it a hoverboard company or hovercraft company, or what was that? What was that client that you mentioned that was a little bit out of the norm?
Air Medevac company, the Air
Medevac
Medics.
company, excuse me. Sorry. Yeah. So what was when you wrote for the MGA and wrote for that kind of a client? What were a couple of the weirder instances or more unusual types of coverage that you need to use selected exclusions for? And do you have a couple of war
Well,
stories like that?
so for the Air Medic company, interestingly enough, the parent company that owned the Air Medic company also owned the aircraft, but they were separate companies. So we insured only the medics, only the what you would call a paramedic for a, if they were in an ambulance, but they're an air paramedic. So they they would get off they would ride in the helicopter, get off, triage the patient, load the patient on, and serve the patient in the air, and then help unload and transfer the patient over to the hospital when they arrived. but because of the way that we had written the policy, we accepted no liability related to the aircraft itself, and we did actually have an aircraft go down,
Oh,
and without a patient, and ended up having to we ended up having to pay a lot of money for the mobile equipment, um, the equipment that the medics were using on board the aircraft. So, yeah, nobody got hurt. It was a strange thing. Helicopters are fascinating and frightening at the same time.
I was gonna say, I mean, I'm not a subject matter expert on that, but I would think it's rare that a medevac kind of would go down at all. I would think they're constantly being maintained, and so that's gotta have been a freak thing for that to have happened.
Yeah, it was just a blip in their live business and insurance lives. It was
Sure.
difficult for sure, but thankfully nobody was permanently injured as far as I remember.
So it's a CGL Masterclass is a 7-part series, and I was going to ask you where you thought this ranked in terms of the other classes. Like, how important is it to know about coverage A versus the other ones? I would think the most important for our audience would be what liability exposures does a business face, like what they need to be aware of. But where do you think exclusions ranks in like in a need to know kind of a situation? And I know that class number 7 deals with coverage B exposures, so exclusions. So what in context is coverage? I mean, it's all important to know, but how important is coverage A and coverage B in the arc of the CGL?
If I were going to choose a section to not spend as much time on, or not study, or not think about much, I would probably choose coverage B,
B.
because of the nature of the types of claims that it covers, and not to dive too deeply into what we'll cover in that class. But coverage B is personal and advertising injury. So it's things that you could consider as a personal injury type thing. False
Personal and
arrest,
advertising injury, is that what you said?
personal and advertising injury. So we're talking about things like false arrest and copyright infringement, and
Oh,
the use of other people's trademarks in your advertising, things like that. We see a lot less of those kinds of claims than we do under coverage A and coverage C. Coverage A being bodily injury and property damage, and coverage C is medical payments. So if I had to skip one, not that I think anyone should,
right.
but I would say that coverage B is probably the least important of all of them. But you make an excellent point about dealing with those liability exposures that different clients might have, different businesses might have, and getting a solid understanding of the who is an insured piece, especially at the time of a claim or an event. That's going to be critical.
I was thinking advertising claims, like somebody suing an ad agency because they saw a billboard that depicted like a pair of shoes they're wearing in a comic way, and it it engendered people to catcall them or something. So I don't know. I don't think of what kind of a claim that would be. But I won't think about it anymore because no one makes fun of my shoes, so I'm good to go. I'm all set. So I wanted to ask you. So this week we have a treat. The Academy that you only get on full moons. I'm not sure where we are astrologically, but so today we had Patrick Rate for the CGL Masterclass, and Thursday we have Patrick Rate for the next installment of the Commercial Property Masterclass. Additional coverage, covered extensions, and optional coverages. I don't know if you could sum all that up in one cogent remark, but can you give us an inkling about what we might expect on Thursday from Thursday's class?
Yeah, so
At
the
least an
additional
inkling.
coverages, coverage extensions, optional coverages, these are coverages that are included in the ISO commercial property policy on the CP0010 that are sometimes overlooked, but some of them are incredibly critical. A few of them are a little bit more discreet. People aren't as familiar with, I don't think. But I think it's a good hour of those coverages that support the primary coverages of the building and personal property. They're all designed in some way to support coverage for the building or personal property in the event of a damage.
Got it. Okay. Well, we're looking forward to for that for Thursday. So I'll say thank you everybody for coming to the webinar today on behalf of our director and instructor, Mr. Patrick Raitt. This is George, your host, saying thanks everybody, and we will look forward to seeing you soon. Have a great day and take care of yourselves. Bye bye.
Take care, everybody.